Hello, my name is Michael Ray, and I'm the director of the American Indian program here at New Mexico State University. We thank you for joining us once again as we continue our series on our digital platform. As we all wish we can come together, we look forward to doing it again soon. But until then, thanks for joining us, and we wish you a good day. As we have this conversation about technology, I had to unmute myself so that we can actually have this conversation. But one of the things, I'm glad that you showed a little bit of the movies and the popular culture that has influenced. And thank you for bringing up Mia. That's my great grandfather, Patrick Desjardins. And
I didn't know that. That's awesome.
yeah, and that's one of the things that we've been talking about for decades is that that's not a person who's pretending to be native. I always used to bring up the whole it's not my fault my great grandfather had those types of women around him when it comes to being up in Red Lake. But as you mentioned, she's now one of our missing and murdered Indigenous women because she's gone.
She's gone.
Kind of the
And
whole.
she's gone without, I will say, I appreciate what they did, but I will say that for me, the big flaw was that they didn't do anything to address it, right?
Yeah.
It was just one day she was there, next day she was gone. And it was this kind of pushback against, like, I guess PC culture, whatever you want to put at that. But it was just like, it was there. And I will say social media is the Wild West right now. But I had an elder that I very much respect, who's done a lot of work against mascots and imagery. And I was like, let's not forget that we don't want to also erase the Native folks that were doing this work. And they just had none of it. They were not having it. And I was like, I need to take a little break for a little while, right? Because I was just like, you're perpetuating the same thing that we run into when we say, please don't erase Native folks, but you're willing to erase Native existence and Native identity without recognizing the history and the story. And I think that's what the colonizers done. So
I changed my background to what it is in my office because I have
it's nice.
my print of my great grandfather's fancy dancer in the background.
That's it. Yeah, right on.
Yeah, and again, these
That's
are
so
the things that we often talk about in our families. We have these double-sided histories when it comes to you know that traditional side plus the side that people had to do to live, to survive in our economies when it comes to, like you mentioned, the boarding school. There were those who may not have been welcomely accepted back in their home communities because they were riding that line of, kind of we have with our students now when they go back home. It's, well, who are you? We don't remember you. Where have you been? You haven't been at village meeting. We don't understand, why are you talking to us this way? We have this conversation when it comes to students and how they go through the changing and shifting of identities when it comes to code switching. You may be able to talk like we talk about, concepts and theories in the classroom and on the university campus, but when you bring that up back home, sometimes that's that shift that you get.
Yep.
But kind of like what you were talking about as well, the erasure of people, utilizing, Tommy Orange when it comes to his book of Native people trying to find a way to learn how to be Native who are urban Native American or half Native American, tribal members. I'm going off of a email question that we had gotten. It's in combining it with a little bit of my own. How do we help out when it comes to those who have to look towards popular culture to gain a little bit of an understanding of where they might be coming from, or who might be utilizing that as a mechanism to propel themselves and find an identity?
Right. And how are they gravitating toward what they see as representational that they don't know necessarily any difference about, right? Like, it's a lot of the stuff where, and the easy point out is to point out mascots, right? And Native folks that identify with, some of the more stereotypical mascots. I was one of those kids. I'll fully admit it. Growing up, I was a Atlanta fan. I was a Washington football fan. So, because for me, trying to find my identity in a world where I'm not represented at all, right? And I grew up on the East Coast and West Coast, right? So, we went to powwows, but my schools were not Native at all until I got back home here and I started teaching. So for me, gravitating towards that, because that was an identity marker for me. I was like, that's Native, right? I got my Native on. And we know it's really detrimental. And, you know, as we unpack all the problems with the mascots, but that's what we run into. And then that's why, I mean, partly what I try to say, you know, in terms of the, you know, the representational stuff is like, I don't begrudge folks that got to get a job. I don't begrudge folks that necessary as Native folks, because I don't punch across for Native folks. Like, if you like that particular mascot, cool. My job is to try and find better things for you. Like, I got to find better representation, because if you got no other representation to go with, that's what you're going to gravitate towards. That's the erasure part. So for me, that's always been the big thing. I tend not to try. I was like, yeah, all my brothers and sisters that are fighting to try and get that stuff removed, I'm always going to support them. But I'm also saying, and we got to find a way for our folks to have a graceful, you know, exit strategy, right? Like some of our folks that have bought into that, because that's part of their identity. And if we eliminate that, then you're like screwing over their identity as well with this, right? For better, for worse. Again, we're not getting into that part of it. We can debate that, but it is an identity marker. And so if it's an identity marker and you say, gone, what just happened? Now my identity has completely shifted, because I don't know what I'm supposed to identify with anymore. And we see that very often when there's nothing there. We all know we identify with probably whatever's handy, right? So we have a lot of folks that identify with mascots and whatnot. And then we also have, you know, folks that are just like, well, find better things. I was like, listen, I love Last of the Mohicans. That's my guilty pleasure. I think that movie's great. Man, he throws the war club, and like the Native guys are totally badass in that. So that was an identifying piece for me, right? Because I was looking for Native heroes. I was actually not a fan of Dances with Wolves, right? I liked there were Native actors in it, and I thought that was cool. But I was just like, it didn't appeal to me anyway. I wanted superheroes, right? So I loved Predator because it had Billy Soul, had our Native guy in there, right? And an awesome Native guy, and like deconstructing it. I love deconstructing it around my identity, because I was just like, he's the only guy that recognized the danger, and he recognized it because of traditional stories from his people, and he's the last guy standing next to the white guy. Now we can get into the whole idea of transference and all the rest, but I was just like, best Native character, possibly it like definitely in the 80s, you know, and possibly even into the 90s for any type of representation. So.
Nice. And also with that, when it comes to the representation, we know that we have quite a bit of students who, like you mentioned, are part Native when it comes to their blood quantum, where they come from. And we know we have students who are outwardly African American looking, outwardly Hispanic looking, outwardly, who will try and go into those identities to try and find a sense of, well, where do I fit? Because popular culture doesn't have a Native like me, because I'm not as brown, or I'm not as red, or I'm not as long haired, or type of a thing. But also in that, sometimes they have that tiredness of having to try to explain why they're Native or how they're Native.
Right. The how. Yep.
And how have you seen that when it comes to the shift in popular culture to look at the natives that are not just the brown skinned natives, but also the light complected, blue eyes, green eyes, you know, Micmac, or, you know, Mekasuki, or, you know, those East Coast natives that really don't have, you know, the dark brown skin that many have been popularized as.
We, you know, not as much, right? Like, I mean, so I try to keep my pulses, you know, on a lot of, and I know there's a ton of Native films that come out, so forgive me. I'm sure there's all sorts of great representations, but the things that percolate to the surface that finally kind of make it toward me often tend to, you know, if it's a non-Native, they often tend to still kind of revolve around, you know, res-based versus urban-based identities. So actually that's been the shift, because we're really looking at like res and urban, you know, like the res versus the urban type of thing, right? I think it's been fascinating or really exciting to see a lot of the shifts in the genre stuff that's starting to come out, right? Like, so the horror has been really fantastic. You know, urban Native kids, right, that are all kind of like grouping together, and then they all like, there's a killer, right? Like that stuff has been great. Jeff Barnaby's Blood Quantum, right? It's now getting released on streaming up in Canada. You know, I'm so excited if it'll get released here, but I've loved Barnaby's work when he did, you know, Rivalry on Ghouls too. You know, hard hitting, urban-y, suburban. I mean, it's kind of res-based, but it's also kind of urban-based, concepts. And, now it's zombie flicks. So I think what we're seeing really is, I don't know how many folks, and I would open this up to anybody, and I should probably post about it, of folks that are looking at talking about identity, and native filmmakers, native comic book folks that are really diving into that kind of stuff. I haven't seen it as much. I think, where I've put my time in is and I'll say this, not talking necessarily about the identity part, right? I haven't been talking about the identity part, although I tend to have my characters a little more mixed. So, I wrote the comic book Six Killer, Alice in Wonderland meets Kill Bill, set in Cherokee country, revolves all around, the Osage murders and the whole sort of all sorts of, it's kind of like Watchmen. There's all sorts of machinations that happened before our main character got in there. But I don't dive into how native the character is, right? It's part of their existence. And they're, the character is mixed, at least the way I write it, but I'm not having those conversations. And I haven't seen a lot of folks that are really having those conversations, for better or for worse. I don't know if it's a flaw. I mean, as you say it, I'm kind of I should write that. I'll do Love and Rockets, native style, right?
Awesome.
Dale DeForest already did that. I'll have to do something else.
So when it comes to, we were talking about, so I'm reading the chat.
Yeah.
Did you want to go ahead and say something, Claudia?
Sure, thank you. I was just wondering, thank you for the presentation, first of all, and sorry I kept on going back and forth. It's just this screen where I have the camera is this big, and this one is where it's bigger, so I have to keep on switching. So one of the questions we have, Monita, also is, we created a website as an offset of the IRD to make it easier for certain tribal communities or tribal members to learn about different news, but we made sure that when the news were put there, that there is always the perspective of the tribal leader or the Secretary of Indian Affairs, or that part. But we, besides Santa Clara, actually, because we have an interview with, a piece of an interview with the governor, we don't have any other story, right?
Yeah.
And part of what I don't know how to get them, first of all, besides highlighting some aspects in those parts of the news. And the other side is, how do we balance the need for many of the communities, right, to say, hey, we have done wrong for many years, and that's part of why we haven't been able to respond in the same ways as cities or things like that. But at the same time, it's not because we are the hopeless, and as you call it, right? I really like that. I have pages and pages of notes of what
awesome. Thank you.
You said, but it's really different pieces of the tragedy of the native existence, but I understood it not in the sense of we have done wrong and that's why you are facing bigger tragedy than other groups, but because you are the tragedy and I wish that wasn't the case kind of thing, So how do we balance yes, these are amazing people who are doing amazing things with the little resources in different communities in different ways, and then also not deleting the hey, they have been done wrong, and that's why the challenges are even worse.
I think you hit it right there. I think it's not that we don't call attention to tragic things that have happened, right? It's not that we don't call attention to historical inequities, ethnocide, genocide. We don't wipe that under the rug. What happens with a lot of the writing that goes on is that it fetishizes the tragedy. It revels in the tragedy. It wallows in that tragedy because you're trying to evoke an emotional response. Now, again, that could be for good or for bad. I tend to believe that it, and I'll just say this for me, I tend to believe it's bad because right now we're facing something, you know, unprecedented since, you know, since the long walk, at least within the Navajo community, right? Like this, the stuff that we're facing. And if we're utilizing it for that purpose, but then I think the long lasting impacts can also be just as disastrous, right? If we continue to fetishize the tragedy beyond this, then we still engage in the fact that like, oh, look at the Navajo sheep herders. And we know all the kids that are down there, right? Yeah, some of their families are sheep herders. Some of their families are engineers. Some of their families are rocket scientists. And some of these kids are going to be rocket scientists, right? So I think really where it lies is in terms of like the reporting or the writing that comes with it is to try and find the folks that are going, the balance comes in really, for me, it's about heroes, right? Interview the doctors that are out there that are doing this day to day, right? Like talk to those folks, talk to the kids that are doing futurisms and figuring out how to like do, you know, on the spot testing, you know, statistical analysis, like showcasing what I always say is like, I say, be brave, be bold, be brilliant, right? That's my mantra, right? So it's like, be brave, go ahead and do this, be bold, because you have to step out. And I know it's so antithetical to the ways we're supposed to exist, but bold doesn't necessarily mean you got to call attention to yourself. Being bold means that you're being powerful. And then being brilliant is that we've been brilliant for thousands of years. Our folks are the ones that built Chaco Canyon, right? Like we carved a civilization into the side of a mountain. So anytime we can remind that's the other balance is for me, anytime we can remind our folks and my people at home that we did this, that we will make it through. And if we're smart, because we are smart, then we are going to come out on the other side better than everybody else, better than we ever were. And I try not to, like, my balance is more trying not to be like Pollyanna about it, you know, coming in and being all just like, look, it's all fine, everybody, because it's not fine. We know that there's stuff that happened. We know there's tragedies. I write about, you know, this stuff all the time. The 1763 massacre of the Conestoga ended the Susquehannock people. The Conestoga disappeared off the face of the earth. But the way I wrote that particular comic and the way that we worked with people was to showcase that, you know what, these are people that didn't die in a tragic fetishization. They died on their feet. They sang before they died. So the last images, and then always showcasing like living Native folks, right? So every comic I write, no matter if it's a tragic thing, if we're talking about like, you know, the reconquest of Pueblo lands, you know, after the rebellion, if we're talking about the decimation of a people, my last image is always Native people standing up, face forward, smiling, nods, but like the last image you're going to see is living Native folks. That's the balance, right? The balance, the fetishization of tragedy comes in when we want to mire in the death cult, when we want to, you know, again, wallow around in how sad the aspect is, rather than showcasing and coming back to saying how we will make it through this. We've done it before. We'll be smart. Doesn't mean that like we can be reckless, right? That's the other part. We put out all these posters. I don't know if you saw any of the propaganda posters we put out, but all these posters, I think the one we put out is like, resilience means common sense. That was one of the terms that I put for that. It was like, resilience means common sense. Don't come into there thinking that you're going to be able to, like, you know, just punch C-19 in the face. Hey, we survived an apocalypse already. I mean, I got all these kids, right? Because they're all 20 and they're all immortal. You know, as we know, it doesn't matter, right? So you're like, they're all gonna come in and be like, man, I'll just lick toilets. I'm gonna do whatever. My people lasted through this, and they're all like thinking they're badass. And I was like, that our people survived because of common sense, and 90% of our population didn't survive. So, and they didn't survive for a number of reasons: targeted genocide, targeted biological warfare, the fact that these types of diseases prey upon the fact. You know, prey upon the heart and spirit of people. You go to comfort people that are dying, and then you catch that. So it's actually, I was looking and say, I was like, the reason why our folks died was because we love our folks so much. We took care of them and that was more heartrending than the actual disease than smallpox could have done, was that we actually had to learn to be more like the colonizer. Because smallpox decimated those populations in England as well. And what those folks used to do was just put boards and they'd lock people in. And they would let them die, right? And so we finally had to learn that lesson. And I think that is the most heart-wrenching lesson that our folks had to learn, is that we got to do this. It's 200 years later. We can use our brains. We can figure out how to make sure grandma and grandpa aren't hurt. That's what I mean when I say, like, we don't fetishize the tragedy. We call it out. We call out colonization. We call it ethnocide, genocide. We call it historical, massacres, but we don't wallow in it, because that's where it becomes the issue for me.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else have any other questions that they wanted to bring up?
There's all your info. Woo. I like to use my hands a lot, even on video.
I just wanted to comment on that part that the last part you discussed of some of the young people saying, hey, I won't wear gloves, I won't wear mask, I'll go out. We had some that had actually been very close to our program because of that, precisely how you express it, because we have lived other tragedies and this is not, new to us, and kind of that attitude. And it took me to a place that I didn't know what to say, because I didn't see it that way, but I am not native from here, at least. So then I just didn't know how to tackle that. And I just thought, well, there were several things that we have learned through history that Native people in this area at least did to protect themselves from many things. And that's why they were able to be resilient and survive even in small, groups of people, but not because they went and exposed themselves willingly. So I appreciate that, because I didn't know how to answer to that.
Yeah. I think it comes back as, for me, we put it on the propaganda is resilience, means common sense, first and foremost. Like, you people weren't dumb. Your ancestors didn't survive so that you could go out and, showcase how awesome a warrior you were against a germ. I mean, I would say this is not like Counting Coup. This is not like you can fight your way out of this. This is invisible stuff. It doesn't matter. You could be the strongest warrior. You catch this, you could die, right? And I think the other part is trying to focus so much on our grandmas and grandpas, right? Like, dude, that's cool. You can be awesome, but you know what it means to be a warrior? It means you take care of your grandmas and grandpas, because they're the ones. We had this crazy conversation, because like the day New Mexico shut down, like the day the schools were shutting down. I think it was Friday, like the 14th of March. I was actually up in Los Alamos, at Los Alamos High School, doing a presentation, knocking on whatever. I was like, all right, none of all you kids, you stay away from me, because y'all are germ infested. I don't trust any of you. And they like broadcast me, and the kids were like 6 feet away. But I was talking with a couple of the Native kids, and they were asking me like, questions, because this was now starting to really be on their mind, right? Because school's closing. And I said, one of the things that you all have to talk about is, put it like this. Maybe it's not even just grandmas and grandpas, but when you're talking about being a warrior, and you're talking about this, and you're also talking about your language and your culture and your language, these are the last speakers of your language. You need to protect your culture and your language, because grandmas and grandpas, not just as a personal thing, just keeping our grandmas and grandpas, these are the ones that are the last connections, right? I know, Michael, when we talked about this, there was some issues in some of our villages where some of the folks died out, right? And so they were some of the keepers. They were some of the tradition keepers. So our folks were having to try and scramble. Imagine that happens. We're seeing it happen in Navajo. Imagine that happens in a small population where 1% of the population, 2% of the population catches this and dies. And that's our grandmas and grandpas, and they're our tradition keepers. So I tend to push back a little bit harder against those kiddos, being like, you talk a good game about being like warrior and culture, and culture means you protect the culture. Culture means you take care of your grandmas and grandpas. It doesn't mean how badass you can be. That's where the sacrifice is. So that's what I come back with them at. And I tend to be a little bit, I'll be a little harder, Autumn on that, because I'm just like, listen, don't play around. I mean, I'm indoors right now. We're all indoors. We know a bunch of people want to go outside right now, and that's cool. We all want to go outside, and some of us take our chances. I got to go grocery shopping. I got to do a little bit here and there, and I'm just like crossing my fingers. but you don't got to invite it, right? Yeah, gloves, mask. We got our cool. I got my Star Wars mask. I'm good to go. You know, but there's a difference between, you know, not being afraid and inviting, you know, inviting it in, right? Like, you can not be afraid against the colonizer, but you don't have to be all just like, well, here's the keys. Like, that's two different things, right? So that's kind of where I try to level with the kiddos as much as possible. I mean, I had to do it as much since I was, you know, but I have folks in my social feed. That's why I made the posters I did. I was like, you got to do this for your grandparents. Quit thinking you're a badass, because being a badass means you take care of your grandparents, means you take care of the elders in the community. They are your wisdom keepers. And if they're gone, you don't have an identity. You have, and I will say this with all respect, you have a pop culture identity. You have an identity where these kids come in and say that, like, this is what pop culture has told me it means to be a Native male or Native female, badass, you know, ready to tussle, fight, because that's my warrior spirit pride. Man, being a warrior means you take care of your homeland. That's what you do, in my mind.
This is where we get a little bit of this role changing now, that as we get older, we need to take that.
Yep.
You know, when we were young guys, you know, running around in the plaza and, you know, just having like a heyday, a feast, you know, it was this, oh yeah, I get to do this, I get to do that. And, you know, oh, you guys keep telling me not to do these things. And now we have to be that person that has to tell people to do these things.
Don't do that.
But there's one question that we had in the chat, and it was, if you can include one book, you know, you showed your precious, you know,
just one book,
either one or two books that you would want to include in like an ethnic studies course that talks about not necessarily the poverty porn that we've been seeing when it comes to a lot of the books, but something that really stands out, that shows a little bit about the story, not necessarily in that tragic way, but maybe in a, you know, a strengths-based way.
Yeah.
Is that book in existence? Because that's always the other question.
In different ways. I mean, so, you know, I think there's a really great, I mean, I'll say it's hard to choose. It's like it's like there is so much great stuff that's written by Native folks in this space. As a general understanding of some things, I think, what is it, Dr. Estes's most recent book, the one he did about Standing Rock, and the title eludes me right now. I think it all has a great historical perspective. I think it's a fantastic book. I would say that one, there's a bit of a caution, because it does, like, I mean, he's Northern, right? So he's Lakota, you know, and so it's like saying, like, his representation of his own people, do we apply that to all the Native folks? And then does that just perpetuate what we see around Native identity? From my perspective, if we were going to do one ethnic studies at NMSU, I would say anything but, like, and I got that up here. Where is it? Yeah, Dr. Joe's book, Joe Sando, Pueblo People, still one of my this is one of my original copies. This one stays on the shelf. I don't even sell this, and this one don't go to the shop at all, right? So, and well thumbed through. Look at my little paper clips up in there, right? So I would say that this is one of them, because I think he breaks it down from an academic standpoint as well as an ethnographic and an insider standpoint. One of the things that I remember teaching my kids, because I used to teach off of this book as an ethnic studies book, but just for my Pueblo kids, was telling them about, like, the whole concept of our governors and our own village leaders and our religious leaders, and then our governor leaders. And he calls it straight up. He's like, governors were always to deal with the white folks, and our folks, our internal village folks, those were to deal with the internal stuff, right? And so when we get into our own conversations about kind of power and control, who's calling the shots for wherever, and I think these are really deep questions. I always go back, and I was like, listen, Dr. Joe, baby, you know, for me, a superhero, because he doesn't mince words. He talks about the identity. He talks about what it means to be Pueblo. He doesn't shy away from what it looks like in New Mexico. He calls out the colonizer, right? He calls out, is like, no, this was torture. You know, the Spanish were torturing our folks, right? I'd rather see this taught than most of the stuff that they put into the K-12 system, right? So if I was to pick one book from my Pueblo standpoint, I would say this. From my historic standpoint, philosophical standpoint, always going to pick, I would say actually the Bind Deloria Reader. Bind Deloria and Dr. Dan Wildcat. I think it's a magnificent understanding of identity, of, you know, ethnography, philosophy, indigeneity. It was profoundly impactful for all of us in education, right? I mean, if you look at any Native dissertation that's ever been written, there's always a Vine Deloria reference, because he's always in all our bibliographies, because I think the work was so impactful. He was the first guy to really illuminate the philosophical constructs. And so if we're thinking about how Native philosophy works, and I think even more so because he comes at it from you know, from the perspective that indigenous philosophy is not a binary. And we've started to fall into more and more binaries that to be Native means you have to be this. And he always said in any of the books, he says, like, these are some traits, but the idea of indigeneity is constantly evolving, because we're still trying to figure out what it means to not be, you know, to be affected by colonization. So a lot of our responses are always in relation to colonization and what colonialism means. So, I mean, I picked those. Those are probably, if I have to pick just one or maybe two.
Awesome. And then one of the things that we also have brought up when it comes to the chat was, can you provide a little bit more comments on Ghost River?
Oh yeah, sure. So Ghost River, just you know, check it out. Red Planet Books and Comics, right up on the main page. We got a digital version that you can download from ghostriver.org, and we're all in digital these days. So go do it. It's free over there, ghostriver.org. It started out as a project from the Library Company of Philadelphia, the oldest library in the world, or in the United States, founded by Ben Franklin himself. You know, Maestro Franklin, right? And they came out to us, the director of scholarly innovation, a fellow by the name of Dr. William Fenton, came out to the Comic-Con, Indigenous Comic-Con, a couple of years ago, says, I got this project. You know, I want to meet some illustrators because I want to make sure that it is Native created and Native authentic. And he's like, we like Native realities, we'd like you to publish it, and I want to find a Native illustrator and a writer. So the Native illustrator ended up getting selected was Wishoyo Alvitre. She's Tongva out of Southern California, Ventura, California. And she recommended me, which I had already worked with her on Six Killer. So our style is pretty well gelled. We knew what we were doing. And we put together this book that chronicles the story of the 1763 Conestoga Massacre, where a number of, we'll say, frontiers folks, I'd say they're the progenitors of the alt-right, got really mad that Native folks were fighting back, and that their government wasn't supporting them, the Quaker government out of Philadelphia. And so they were incited to violence by a number of their townsfolks and clergy. And rather than fighting the Native folks on their own, you know, on the terms like warriors would do, they turned back inland to march on Philadelphia because they were cowards, and they massacred the Conestoga folks over the course of about 2 weeks. They killed about 6 of them in their home village in the Conestoga Indian Township, which is just outside of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And then 2 weeks later, 2 days after Christmas, they returned to Lancaster, where the people had been taken to the workhouse, the prison, for their safety, the remaining 14. And they told the town governors to step aside, and they came in and they slaughtered the remaining 14. And that was the end of the people that termed themselves, or that we know of as the Susquehannock, also the Conestoga. We don't know what their traditional name was for themselves. There's no record of it. So that was really, like, in some of the research and the work that we were doing, I always try to make sure that people reference themselves by their own home names, but we have no record of what they called themselves. Susquehannock is a lot like Anasazi. It was a term that I think the Lenape used, or the Seneca used, meaning enemy, essentially. It's the same thing, but it's the only representation we have of the people. A lot of the kin, so this doesn't, like, the term of the Susquehannock and the Conestoga, those folks ceased to exist in that home township, but a lot of their people migrated. So their ancestors, that blood still exists. A lot of them moved with the Lenape, and many of them moved up north with the Seneca and the Haudenosaunee and some of their other folks up in that direction. So we know that there are ancestors, you know, in the space that continue to be there. And we went out to Philly and Lancaster, and we met with a wonderful group called Circle Legacy, which is the group of Native folks outside of Lancaster. And we put together this story to do them honor, and we asked to do honor, right? Like we made sure we did it right. Right. We got so many folks that like to write stories. I was like, these ain't my people. So I got to go out there and ask for the blessings of these people before I start to write their story. And so we did, right? And so we wrote this story, tells the story of the Conestoga, also tells the story of the Moravian Lenape. So Lenape folks that were also taken into Philadelphia. It's the only time in American history that Quakers took up arms. They took up arms to protect the native folks, the Christian natives, the Moravian Lenape at that space, against this mob that was coming in after they killed the Conestoga folks. They were marching on Philadelphia. And then there's all sorts of stuff that goes on with that. There's a pamphlet war. There's, accusations back and forth. And what it essentially does is, the native folks were really just kind of props historically between these warring groups of the Quakers and the frontiers folks. So we wanted to give them their own voice because they don't have their story. So we wrote that story. It's been really popular. I was supposed to be out in Philly last month, like this month, because it was the closing of they had a big exhibit that was going on. So I did some Zooming out for there. I was like, man, I've been in Philly so often. Hopefully when this clears, I'm gonna get back out there because we still want to present out of Lancaster. We haven't had the chance to do that yet. So we'll keep some wheels on this, but yeah, that's Ghost River.
Awesome. And, next time when you're Philly, I'll make sure and let my student services mom over at Penn, over at the GIC, the Greenfield Intercultural Center, know, and maybe we can set something up where you can talk to their natives at Penn group over there.
Guy froze. Oh, my internet went out. Oh, there you're back. Okay,
no, we're good. Yeah. But
okay,
no, good. I was just talking about, maybe when next time you're in Philadelphia, I can let my student services mom over at Penn know, because I was a part of the natives at Penn, but back when we used to call it Six Directions at Penn. And so this is one of those things where, again, it's the networking, the communications, the connecting dots of helping out others, individuals, talk about getting that word out. But definitely, is there any other questions that anybody else have? Because I can definitely ask a ton of questions, but I also want to make sure that I can share this space because, again, these are those types of things that we wanted to talk about when it comes to getting beyond some of the stories that we see and getting having these types of conversations, because sometimes these kind of conversations can't happen in a classroom because there's always that, again, well, I was always told, or, my family always knows this, or, the various ways that we understand and get the knowledge that we receive, kind of like you mentioned when it comes to the generalization of Native American epistemology. Sometimes it's various ways that we learn things. Sometimes we learn things by others observing us and letting us know that, okay, now we see this trait in you, you're ready to go on to this next experience. You're ready to go on to the next area, as opposed to the Western education mindset that's, we're going to throw everything at you. If it doesn't collect, it doesn't pull, if it doesn't stick, it's your fault.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it creates this, it is the binary, right? The whole point is that, like, throughout our history, we know is about scaffolding. You would move to that next space when you could demonstrate that you had the skill and capacity to be able to get to that next space. But there was no judgment if you didn't. It was just where you were. That's the other part, right? There's such a judgment within the academy, which is such a Western mentality. It's like, oh, you don't know that? Well, you're a dummy. It's like, yo, maybe not. Maybe I got all sorts of other skills. I got all sorts of other gifts. But it comes at it from this perspective that if you don't know that, or you don't get that, then, you're, like, you don't know what you're doing. And that's not indigenous methodology, right? That epistemology, the way that we come at it is like, listen, everybody's got a space in the community. We don't know what that space is going to be. You don't know what that space is going to be. We're just here to make sure that you have a good heart and a good spirit, and that you're going to cycle back and do that work in the community, right? And that's who you take care of. I've been working at Laguna on and off whenever I'm called, and whenever I get out there for 20 years now, since I've been an adult. My dad said, come home and teach. I was like, all right, what else? I was like, okay. And I went home and taught at LA, and I go off and I get my grad degree, and I'm still working out there. I work out at Acoma with the school system. I'm doing evaluation work. I'm trying to figure out how to get supplies out to the kids right now. Like, we're trying to get some stuff out to the kiddos that don't have internet access, of like, here's some coloring pages, here's a crossword puzzle, like, do something, right? Like, because Some of these kids ain't going to be able to get online and do the fun Zoom and all the stuff that my kid has, because I live in Albuquerque, right? And our kids at Pewaukee don't, because they ain't got no internet. So we're trying to figure out that. That's the scaffolding, right? That's how it works.
Definitely. And again, it's also, where do we meet when it comes to, we know we can provide on the campus, we know we can create the environments, but I know for us at New Mexico State University, we're a land grant institution, and we're not really looking at this of, now we're in people's homes, and sometimes we're not even at their homes, we're at their post office waiting for them to be picked up, type of a thing. And how do we make sure that we talk about and look at this digital inequity that we have going on when
digital
it comes
inequity.
to the infrastructure that we have, and how can we amend our curriculum to meet the needs and to meet where people are at, as opposed to where we would want them at. So,
yeah, absolutely. That's going to be the question coming in, because we're faced it now. So we got to figure it out.
Definitely. And thank you very much for sharing your time with us as we get to, 6 minutes over. Yeah.
We did pretty good. We did pretty good. So,
but thank you very much again for being with us. And we just want to talk about, again, Dr. Sando's book. We have them in our library. I know that's something I looked at when it comes to my time at Penn, and, my research on the evolution of marumas and how they come to be now from what they were way back when. And this is one of those things where sometimes we go elsewhere to learn some of our own culture, but because again, we weren't ready to hear it when we were talked about it, when we were told it in these specific areas. Thank you for again coming on and talking with us.
Thank you all.
I definitely want to get you down in Las Cruces to have this conversation.
We'll get there soon. I know. We're gonna figure it out once all this stuff gets a little bit more squared away, right? And we can take care of our folks and make sure that everybody is safe. So, but I'm always at your disposal for all you guys. Anything else, always hit me up. I'm sure you can post out, to folks, just wordcraft circle at wordcraft.director@gmail.com. The email, so you can just send me on with that. If you got any writing that you all want to take a look at, there's mentorship. Like, we're relaunching our sites and getting everything consolidated around how we support Native writers, storytellers, and creatives. So all this work factors into that. So, anybody that needs any support, we can certainly help. We got lots of networking and folks to be able to support Native folk coming through and the kiddos.
Awesome.